black Mercedes pulled up to the crumbling apartment building on Maple Street. Its pristine paint job a stark contrast to the peeling walls and broken windows surrounding it. Richard Sterling stepped out, his $1,000 shoes clicking against the cracked pavement as he surveyed his property with cold, calculating eyes. Today was eviction day, and he had no patience for sob stories or excuses. At 52, Richard had built his real estate empire on one simple principle. Business was business, and emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. The Wilson family in apartment 4B had been late on rent for 3 months, and his patience had run out. He clutched the eviction papers in his manicured hand, already mentally calculating how quickly he could renovate the unit and find a more reliable tenant. But what Richard was about to hear from 2 innocent little girls would shatter his worldview forever, forcing him to confront the man he'd become and the child he'd once been. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices, and today those voices would change everything. Richard Sterling hadn't always been the ruthless businessman who stood before this rundown building. 25 years ago, he'd been a different man, entirely one who believed in helping others and making a difference in the world. But life is a way of hardening even the softest hearts, and Richard's transformation had been both gradual and complete. His empire consisted of over 300 rental properties scattered across the city, most of them in working-class neighborhoods, where people struggled to make ends meet. Richard had learned long ago that sympathy was expensive, and he'd trained himself to see his tenants not as human beings with stories and struggles, but as numbers on a spreadsheet. Rent late? Eviction notice. Excuses? He'd heard them all. Promises to pay? Worthless words that didn't pad his bank account. The Wilson family had been flagged in his system for months. Sarah Wilson, a single mother of 2 young daughters, had been a model tenant for over 2 years until her world came crashing down. But Richard didn't know the details, and more importantly, he didn't want to know them. Details made things complicated, and complications interfered with profit margins. As he climbed the narrow, dimly lit staircase to the 4th floor, the building seemed to groan under his presence. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, revealing patches of water damage underneath. The carpet was worn thin in the middle of the hallway, creating a path that told the story of countless footsteps belonging to people just trying to survive another day. Richard had bought this building 5 years ago for a fraction of its potential value, seeing opportunity where others saw decay. He'd done the minimum required repairs to meet safety codes, and nothing more. Why invest in beauty when people would pay to live here regardless? It was a philosophy that had made him wealthy beyond measure, but had also made him something else entirely, something he was about to discover he didn't like very much. The building housed 12 families, each one fighting their own battles, dreaming their own dreams and struggling with their own demons. But to Richard, they were simply sources of monthly income, and when that income stopped flowing, the source needed to be replaced. Richard reached the 4th floor and paused outside apartment 4B, straightening his silk tie and checking his gold Rolex. It was exactly 9 a.m. punctuality, was another one of his business principles. He raised his fist a knock, but before his knuckles could make contact with the door, he heard something that made him freeze. "Mommy, why are you crying again?" The voice was small, sweet, and filled with the innocent concern that only a child could possess. "I'm not crying, sweetheart," came the reply, though the tremor in the woman's voice suggested otherwise. "Mommy's just thinking about things. Is it because of the mean man who wants us to leave?" This was a different voice, slightly older but still unmistakably that of a young child. Richard's hand remained suspended in the air, his businesslike confidence wavering for just a moment. He told himself he shouldn't be listening, that private conversations were none of his concern. But something about the innocence in those voices held him captive. "He's not mean, girls," the mother Sarah Wilson said softly. "He's just doing his job. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard decisions." "But where will we go, Mommy?" the younger voice asked. "Will we have to sleep in the car again like before Daddy went to heaven?" The words hit Richard like a physical blow, though he couldn't quite understand why. He'd heard similar stories before: single mothers, financial struggles, family tragedies. They were common themes in his line of work, background noise to the business of real estate. So, why did this feel different? "We'll figure something out, Emma," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as she tried to comfort her daughter. We always do, don't we? Remember what Daddy used to say. When life gets hard, we get harder. Both girls recited in unison, their young voices filled with a determination that seemed far too mature for their years. Richard found himself leaning closer to the door, drawn into this private family moment despite his better judgment. There was something about their ritual, about the way they supported each other, that stirred a memory deep within a memory he'd buried under years of cold business decisions and calculated indifference. Finally gathering himself, Richard knocked firmly on the door. The conversation inside immediately stopped, replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps and whispered instructions. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and her clothes clean but obviously worn. Despite the stress lines around her eyes and the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her very being, Sarah Wilson maintained a dignity that impressed Richard against his will. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I've been expecting you." Behind her, Richard could see two little girls peering around their mother's legs. One appeared to be about 6 years old, with pigtails and missing front teeth, while the other looked to be around 8, with serious brown eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. "Mrs. Wilson," Richard replied, his voice automatically shifting into business mode. "I'm here regarding the overdue rent. As specified in the notice, you have until noon today to vacate the premises." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Mr. Sterling, I know I've been behind, and I know you have every right to ask us to leave, but I'm wondering if we could discuss a payment plan. I start my new job next Monday, and I can have half the back rent to you by the end of the week." Richard had heard variations of this speech hundreds of times before. New job promises, payment plans, desperate negotiations from people who had run out of options. His standard response was simple and final. "Business is business, Mrs. Wilson. I can't make exceptions." But as he prepared to deliver his usual dismissal, the younger girl Emma tugged on her mother's shirt. "Mommy," she whispered loudly, "why don't you tell him about how you saved up to buy us Christmas presents by not eating lunch for a whole month? Maybe he'll understand that you're really, really good at keeping promises." The older girl, whom Richard assumed was Emma's sister, quickly shushed her sibling. "Emma, remember what we talked about. Grown-up problems are for grown-ups to solve." But the damage was done. Emma's innocent revelation hung in the air like a spotlight, illuminating a truth that Richard had spent years avoiding. Behind every number on his spreadsheet was a human being making impossible choices and unimaginable sacrifices. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to laugh off her daughter's comment. "Kids say the darndest things, don't they, Mr. Sterling? Emma, honey, why don't you and Lily go play in your room while Mommy talks to the nice man?" But Richard found himself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to deliver the cold rejection that had become second nature to him. The image of this woman, this mother choosing to go hungry, so her children could have Christmas presents, was burning through his carefully constructed walls of indifference. "Wait," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "How old are your daughters, Mrs. Wilson?" Sarah looked surprised by the question. "Emma just turned 6 last month, and Lily is 8. Why do you ask?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he found himself studying the apartment over Sarah's shoulder. It was small, probably less than 600 square feet, but it was immaculately clean. The furniture was old and mismatched, clearly collected from thrift stores and garage sales, but everything was arranged with care. Children's artwork covered one wall at a gallery, and he could see handmade Christmas decorations still hanging in the window, probably the ones Sarah had sacrificed her lunches to buy. "Mr. Sterling?" Sarah prompted gently. "Are you all right?" "Tell me about your husband," Richard heard himself say, though he couldn't quite believe the words were coming from his mouth. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. David was a construction worker. He was killed in an accident on a job site 8 months ago. No life insurance, no safety net. She gestured helplessly around the apartment. "Just us." From the bedroom, Richard could hear the two girls playing quietly, their voices a soft murmur of imagination and childhood games. But occasionally, their words would drift into the living room, each sentence a small dagger aimed directly at his conscience. "When we move, do you think we'll have a yard?" Emma was asking her sister. "I don't know," Lily replied with the patience of an older sibling. "But remember what Mommy said, home isn't about where you live. It's about who you love." "I wish Daddy could come with us to our new home," Emma said wistfully. "He will," Lily assured her. "Daddy lives in here now." Richard assumed she was pointing to her heart. "And in here." Now her head. "So he goes everywhere we go." As Richard listened to the girls' conversation, something cracked open inside his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Suddenly, he was 8 years old again, standing in a similar apartment with his own mother, watching as stern-faced men in expensive suits explained why they had to leave. His father had died when Richard was 7, leaving behind nothing but debt and broken promises. His mother had worked 3 jobs trying to keep them afloat, but it hadn't been enough. They'd been evicted from their apartment, then from a small room they'd rented above a grocery store, then from the tiny efficiency they'd found on the outskirts of town. Richard remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the way his mother would cry when she thought he wasn't looking. He remembered sleeping in their car, washing in gas station bathrooms, and watching his mother choose between buying food and putting gas in the tank so she could get to work. But most of all, he remembered the kindness of strangers, a landlord who gave them an extra week, the neighbor who brought them dinner, the teacher who made sure he had school supplies even when his mother couldn't afford them. Those acts of compassion had kept him alive, had given him hope when hope seemed impossible. When had he forgotten those lessons? When had he become one of the stern-faced men in expensive suits, prioritizing profit over people? "Mr. Sterling?" Sarah's voice brought him back to the present. "I understand if you can't make any exceptions. I really do. But could I ask for just one more week? I know it's a lot to ask, but—" "No," Richard said firmly, and Sarah's face fell. But then he continued, "No, you can't have one more week. You can have as long as you need." Sarah stared at Richard as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Richard was asking himself the same question. The words had come from somewhere deep inside him, from a place he thought had died years ago. But now that he'd said them, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Relief. "I said you can stay," Richard repeated, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Keep the apartment. We'll work out a payment plan that actually makes sense for your situation." "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Why? Why would you do that?" Richard looked past her to where the 2 girls had appeared in the bedroom doorway, drawn by their mother's emotional reaction. Emma was clutching a worn stuffed elephant, while Lily held her sister's free hand protectively. They were watching the adult conversation with the careful attention of children who had learned too young that their world could change in an instant. "Because," Richard said slowly, "a long time ago, I was in a situation very similar to yours, and someone showed me kindness when I needed it most. I'd forgotten that lesson until today." He pulled out his business card and wrote his personal cell phone number on the back. "Call me Monday after you start your new job. We'll figure out a payment schedule that works for your budget. And Mrs. Wilson?" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Take your time. There's no rush." As Richard turned to leave, Emma's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Mister," she called out, her young voice filled with curiosity, "are you the angel Daddy sent to help us?" Richard felt his throat constrict with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He knelt down at Emma's eye level, noting how her sister immediately stepped protectively closer. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm just a man who forgot something important and needed 2 very smart little girls to remind him." "What did you forget?" Lily asked, her 8-year-old skepticism evident in her voice. Richard really smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I forgot that being rich isn't about how much money you have. It's about how much kindness you can afford to give away." The transformation in Richard Sterling's life didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. The Wilson family became his first step toward remembering who he used to be, but they weren't his last. Richard began visiting his properties personally, not to collect rent or serve eviction notices, but to understand the people who lived there. He learned about Mrs. Chun in Building C, who was caring for her mother with Alzheimer's while working 2 part-time jobs. He discovered that the Martinez family in Building J had been living without heat for 3 weeks because they couldn't afford a repair bill. For the first time in decades, Richard saw his tenants as people rather than profit margins. And with that shift in perspective came a shift in his business practices. He established an emergency assistance fund for tenants facing temporary hardships. He began investing in real improvements to his properties, not just a minimum required by law, but upgrades that made the apartments genuine homes. The financial impact on his bottom line was significant, but Richard discovered something surprising. He didn't care. The numbers in his bank account had stopped being the measure of his worth. Instead, he measured his success by the thank you cards he received, by the children who waved at him when he visited properties, by the knowledge that he was helping families stay together rather than tearing them apart. Sarah Wilson had indeed started her new job as promised, working as a medical assistant at a local clinic. True to his word, Richard had worked out a payment plan that fit her budget, and she'd been making steady progress on the back rent. But more than that, she'd become something Richard hadn't expected, a friend. The girls had adopted him as an honorary uncle, and Richard found himself looking forward to their impromptu visits to his office. Emma would show him her latest artwork, while Lily would quiz him about business, already showing the sharp mind that reminded him so much of himself at that age. Uncle Richard, Emma had said during one of their visits, "Mommy says you saved us, but I think we saved you too." She was right, of course. In trying to evict the Wilson family, Richard had instead found something he'd lost years ago: his humanity. He'd rediscovered the man he'd been before grief and cynicism had hardened his heart, before success had become more important than significance. Word of Richard's transformation spread through his properties like wildfire. Tenants who had once feared him began approaching him with their problems, knowing they would find understanding rather than judgment. Other landlords in the city began to take notice of his new approach, some mocking him for being soft, while others quietly began implementing similar policies in their own buildings. Richard established a scholarship fund for children of his tenants, ensuring that kids like Lily and Emma would have opportunities their parents could never afford. He partnered with local organizations to provide job training, child care assistance, and financial counseling. His properties became more than just places to live. They became communities where people looked out for each other. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to maximize his profits, he'd been slowly destroying the very thing that made his business valuable. Happy tenants stayed longer, took better care of their homes, and recommended his properties to others. His occupancy rates increased, his maintenance costs decreased, and his reputation in the community improved dramatically. But the real measure of his transformation came on a quiet Tuesday evening, 6 months after that life-changing encounter with the Wilson family. Sarah had invited him for dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and garlic bread that the girls had helped prepare. As they sat around the small kitchen table, Emma suddenly looked up from her plate with the kind of serious expression that only small children can master. "Uncle Richard," she said, "I have a question." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Before you met us, were you lonely?" The question hit Richard with unexpected force. He'd never thought himself as lonely. He'd been too busy, too focused, too driven to consider such things. But looking back at the man he'd been just 6 months ago, he realized Emma was absolutely right. He had been profoundly, devastatingly lonely, surrounded by wealth and success, but isolated from genuine human connection. "Yes," he admitted, "I think I was very lonely, Emma. I just didn't realize it." "Well, you're not lonely anymore," she announced with the confident certainty of a 6-year-old, "because you're part of our family now." And in that moment, sitting in a tiny apartment that he'd once tried to empty, surrounded by a family that he'd once tried to displace, Richard Sterling understood what true wealth really meant. Richard's story spread beyond his immediate circle, inspiring articles in local newspapers, and eventually a feature in a national magazine about socially responsible business practices. But he didn't tell his story for recognition or praise. He told it because he understood the power of examples, the way one person's transformation can plant seeds of change in others. He spoke at business conferences, not about profit maximization or market domination, but about the intersection of success and significance. He shared a lesson that Emma and Lily had taught him, that the most valuable currency isn't money but compassion. "I used to think that business was just business," he would tell his audiences. "I believed that emotions were weaknesses, and that kindness was a luxury I couldn't afford. But two little girls taught me that the opposite is true. Kindness isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. It's the foundation upon which all lasting success is built." The Wilson family remained central to his life. He watched Emma lose her remaining baby teeth and start first grade. He cheered as Lily mastered multiplication tables and joined the school debate team. He was there for Sarah's graduation from nursing school, a goal she'd been able to pursue thanks to the stability his kindness had provided. And sometimes on quiet evenings when he sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Richard would think about the man he used to be: cold, calculating, successful, but empty. He'd think about that morning when he climbed the stairs to apartment 4B with eviction papers in his hand and ice in his heart. He'd never imagined that the words of two innocent children could shatter his worldview so completely. But perhaps that's the power of innocence. It sees truth where experience sees complications, finds hope where cynicism sees impossibility. Today, Richard Sterling is still a wealthy man, though his definition of wealth has evolved considerably. His bank account is smaller than it once was, but his life is immeasurably richer. He measures his success not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, not in properties owned, but in families helped, not in power wielded, but in kindness shared. The building on Maple Street still stands, though it's hardly recognizable as the same structure Richard first visited that transformative morning. Fresh paint covers the walls, new carpets warm the hallways, and the sound of children's laughter echoes through corridors that once seemed filled only with struggle and despair. Emma and Lily Wilson are growing up in that building, surrounded by a community that looks out for one another and a landlord who has become family. They're learning that kindness is contagious, that generosity multiplies when it's shared, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply care about another person's story. And Richard Sterling, the man who once saw tenants as numbers on a spreadsheet, has learned perhaps the most important lesson of all, that we are all just one conversation, one moment of genuine connection, one act of unexpected kindness away from remembering who we really are beneath all our defenses and fears. The two little girls who asked their mother about the mean man who wanted them to leave never knew the full impact of their innocent words. They simply lived their truth, spoke their reality, and trusted in the fundamental goodness of the world around them. In doing so, they didn't just save their family from eviction. They saved a man's soul from the prison he'd built around his own heart. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest questions, asked by the purest hearts, heard by souls ready to remember who they were always meant to be. What did you think of Richard's incredible transformation? Have you ever had a moment where a child's innocent words change your perspective on life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories of unexpected kindness and second chances.